All right, folks, welcome back to another episode or another TWiP Pro Critique. In this one, I'm sitting down with Mr. Don Komarechka to review some of the latest submissions to the TWiP Pro community. This is TWiP. All right, so we've got, what, 14, 15 or so images to go through this week. Thank goodness I have somebody who knows their way around a pixel or two. Mr. Don Komarechka is joining me today to help take a look at some of these awesome submissions. Don, how you doing, man?
I'm great, Frederick. Thank you so much for having me on this little critique session here, because I love critiquing photographs. I love looking at images where a photographer might have taken a different angle on something that I would have shot, or something completely unrelated to anything that I do, but applying the fundamental rules of photography to that and seeing what can be improved or changed or whatever other creative options they may have had available to them. So I've had a look through these images, and I think it'll make for a very good discussion.
Yeah, no, I think so too, and it's really, honestly, it's really fun. I'm glad we started up this critique channel on TWiP Pro, because like we were saying before we started recording, it's refreshing to see other people's work, right? And it's also refreshing to see, you know, what people consider to be their best work, you know, because they're submitting, in many cases, they're submitting it for critique because they think it's their best, and in some cases they just want feedback on a different technique or something that they did, and we get to, I think they win because they're getting the input from, you know, two sort of foreign parties, and we win because we get to talk about it and kind of learn from it. The audience wins because they learn, hopefully, from things that we're saying, right?
Gets my creative juices flowing. And I'll often, when I'm doing a critique session with students, either locally or online, I'll see something that kind of sparks an idea in me. It might not even be in the image, but an idea that I have to make that photograph better. I often say to myself, you know, what if I take this other concept that I have been, you know, maybe it's on the back burner, I haven't fully executed yet. This is the missing puzzle piece to make that happen. Right. And there is a lot of value in writing very constructive criticisms and critiques for photographs. And everybody should do this as a learning process for themselves, because you can learn a lot from other people's images rather than your own. You'll have a really hard time critiquing your own work. It's much easier to critique somebody else's and to find both merits and failures in both image, and to make a point of that across the board will make you a better photographer.
Yeah, it's like critiquing your own kid. Before we dive into this first image, I just want to tell people a little bit about you and where your podcast is and all that, just to get that out of the way first.
Sure. So people can find me online at photogeekweekly.com. That's where I have my podcast, where it is a weekly dive into the most technical and science and not often talked about stories in the photographic industry. And I started that up in November, and it's going great so far. Love it. If you want to see my work or you want to get in touch with me personally, that's doncom.ca, where you will see a portfolio of really off the beaten path imagery, stuff that I consider to be the unseen world, the stuff that I don't normally see with my own eyes. And the camera becomes a tool for me to explore things. And when you do that, a really fundamental thing has to happen. You're thinking in terms, okay, this world that you're capturing with the camera doesn't exist to us the way we normally perceive things, but how can it still be beautiful? How can the lines and shapes form a narrative? How can the art of narrowing things down? Photography is a subtractive art. How can you apply that to something that is completely irrelevant to our daily life, that is so far into the unknown that it still feels familiar? And it's a really difficult process to go through, but it's one that, hey, I've enjoyed for, geez, about a decade now.
I can't think of a better person to tackle that type of photography than you, Don Komarechka. All right, let's dive in. The first image is from Dave James, and he's titled this one Miriam and Sterling in Natural Light. Let's bring this up on the screen here. Okay, I've got this one up. This is Dave James's Miriam and Sterling. What do you think of this one?
I like the expression on the faces, and I like the lighting on the faces as well, because you've got a little bit of highlights. They're not too bright. It just gives a certain contour to especially the male's face here in this particular image. That's created by the natural light from the background. But oh boy, that background, that is killing me here, because it is so stark in the dark shadows and overexposed, like completely non-recoverable highlights. And especially when you have people with dark hair and dark complexion against what would be pure white. Now, they've brought it back down a little bit from what I can tell to be something of a light gray. It's almost white, but it's not quite there, in an attempt to recover details. And for me, that always bothers me a little bit. If something is completely overexposed, leave it overexposed. I mean, just deal with that. That's the cards you're dealt with. If you try to bring back something, it becomes a blob of light gray instead of a blob of white, and it's less believable to me mentally to kind of wrap my head around that. This location, they're in the shadow, you know, the faces are in the shadow, and that's great. But if there was some way to clean up that background, to make it a little bit less in terms of those, you know, almost vertical, but ever so on a slightly angled diagonal lines, they are just so distracting to me from this image that the subject matter itself works really, really well with. So there's good and bad to this particular photograph, and I think that, you know, the photographer who made this image did a good job with what they were given. You can see a few slight details around the woman's legs, specifically maybe around her heel and around her legs, where the background gets a little bit brighter. Like a little bit of a halo effect. So I can tell that they were trying to knock things down in order to make lesser distractions within the frame. And that's great. A trained eye can spot that. The average person would never notice it. But that's the kind of thing that a quick little adjustment with the burn tool can clean up as well. But yeah, I like it.
Cool. Yeah. When I look at this image, the blown highlights don't necessarily bother me, especially he titled this one Natural Light. And there's an area here in Sacramento at the Capitol that looks very similar to this, with sort of pylons and light streaming through them, you know, because it's a west facing building. So, you know, you get that afternoon light shining in, and it's challenging. And like you highlighted correctly, that you're shooting dark complected people on a high contrast background, but that part doesn't bother me so much, because I'm looking at the background as geometric shapes, right? So I'm not necessarily looking for detail. The blown highlights look kind of intentional to me, because now it just becomes kind of a, you know, geometric pattern behind them, horizontal and vertical lines. So that doesn't bother me. But what I really love about this photo, I like the pose a lot. I like the pose that he chose with the guy kind of in that sort of, you know, strong stance, one hand in the pocket, cool dude looking at the camera, and beautiful girl grabbing onto his arm, you know, looking at him, looking at the camera. I kind of like that. I like that pose and those looks a lot, and his kind of, you know, knowing Mona Lisa stare at the camera.
Well, and a good pose is often underrated by me, because I'm not a portrait photographer. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. And since you said it, absolutely, I completely agree. I don't think I would change anything about the pose. Not being a portrait photographer, I don't know how much I would change, but it feels natural. It feels like it's a proud moment, and I think that's what the photographer was going for there. Yeah,
it almost feels candid. So yeah, I like it. I like it. Thanks, Dave James, for submitting this. The next photo is by member Craig Stampley. He's titled this one Loading Dock at Night. And let's see if we can't bring that up. Loading Dock at Night. Here you go. What do you think of this one?
I want to know what this place is, first and foremost. I mean, it has my curiosity. Like, is it a hospital? Is it a prison? You've got this window where there could be a guard there, you know,
and any place, yeah.
Posts. That seems like there's a certain level of security with the cameras and everything else around.
For sure.
And so that leaves me, you know, in the title it says GOMA, and I can kind of see a little bit of that on the loading dock logo there. So I could probably research it and figure it out. But the image should probably tell me that. Right. There should be something in the image that helps me identify exactly what the location is. The exposure is good. You know, I don't mind the framing at all for this kind of architectural shot, especially when you look at the lines on the left and right edge of the frame. They're nice and straight. Yeah. And so you've got some good technical expertise along the top as well. But it's missing a narrative. It's missing a story. And so if there was even just a person in the window looking back at the camera as if you are trying to, maybe you're on the back of a truck in a loading dock, or maybe there is a truck there, or even a dolly with some crate of something on it. There has to be something in this image that tells me what the place is, what's going on, and what the story, the purpose for this image is. This is a very good documentary shot for the architecture, but it doesn't feel like it's architecture that needs to be framed exclusively as such. It seems like it is a stage that needs an actor.
Yeah, really, really good points. Technically, when I look at this image, I don't see anything technically wrong with it at all. I mean, I see the exposure's great. I love the composition of it, the vanishing point lines, everything's converging to the middle. That's all cool. I 100% agree with you about the story thing, because what I would want to see in here, when you mention story, I'd want to see like a sleeping security guard in that window thing on the left, right? There's someone in there sleeping. Maybe remove that red tray or whatever that thing is, and maybe there's somebody standing there taking a smoke break or something, But yeah, but then in terms of the place having context, it being the GOMA, whatever that is. Craig Stanfley, tell us what the GOMA is in TWiP Pro. But I look at a shot like this, and I don't necessarily judge this kind of shot on the merits of it needing to stand on its own. I agree it needs an element in there of story, just so that you're like, okay, what is this, right? And I think having somebody, a security guard in there, or someone sitting outside on the smoke break or something would do it. But I would imagine this photo is intended to be taken in context of a larger story. Like I could see this in a magazine ad or a newspaper or a blog post about the GOMA, right?
Right. So where the image itself is not the only structure within the narrative.
Right. It's just another piece of
text or additional images that would carry that story forward.
It's a supporting character. Yeah. But it could easily go from supporting character to star if there was some sort of whimsical element in there. So yeah, I 100% agree. Very cool. Craig Stanfley is rocking it. Thanks for submitting this, man. I love it. All right, next image up is from Mark Domke, and he's titled this one, The Nebraska State Capitol Building. Wait till you see this one. All right, it's up on the screen.
It's a beautiful building, and it's framed like nice and center. Again, architectural photography, especially for a building like this that is intended to be symmetrical. We see that symmetry here within that building. It's really well straight on. At night, you've got a great nighttime exposure where the lights are, for the most part, filling in the surroundings very beautifully. There's nothing that is pitch black, so that it kind of gives me that nice blue hour feel. This is the image that before we started recording, I looked at the longest because I was trying to figure out a way to make it better. And it's really hard for an image like this because it's at such a distance and everything is so static. I mean, I wouldn't change the camera angle in any way. I love the position. But the only thing that I could possibly think of is lines that tie everything together, because the architecture is so static and the surrounding is so unorganized in terms of, there's different roads and different lights in different places. The symmetry breaks down as soon as you step away from the architecture. And how could you possibly guide the eye across the frame in a more meaningful way? Well, maybe it's photographing it a little bit earlier, where you've got just the tiny tip of the sun, depending on the angle, just grazing the horizon that creates shadows that all cast across the frame in a particular line, right? That's one possible way to do it. Or to potentially shoot with a longer exposure. I have no idea if he's on flying a drone or something to get this shot.
This is a drone, yeah.
But if you could have the clouds blurred over a longer exposure, multiple minutes long, then that could create a guiding line in the frame as well, just to draw your eye through the frame instead of looking just at the static singular anchor without having any reason to look at the rest of the surroundings around it. Yeah,
good points. I'm 99% sure this was shot with a drone, only because I know Mark talks about aerial photography a lot. So this one is probably definitely, I'm gonna go definitely shot with a drone. I agree with you. Compositionally, this is great. I love the symmetry going on in here. technically, the one thing that I would fix in here or change in here is we, you know, as photographers, we know our eyes go to the brightest thing in the scene, right? So that one light on the left corner of the lower structure there is really bright, and it's obviously an artifact of doing a semi-longer exposure.
Yeah, well, but yeah, the funny thing is, there's also no light on the other side.
On the other side, yeah, so it breaks the
here's
symmetry.
Here's an interesting way that you might find a fix to that. If you mirror the right side onto the left side, like you know, cut a section of that off and then kind of paste it over that area, painting it in very carefully with an adjustment or a layer mask in Photoshop, and then drop the opacity of that down a little bit. You might be able to recover a little bit of detail that way if you can get things to line up properly. You might not, because the angle might not be perfectly in sync, but there are options that might be helpful there. Conversely, you could possibly take that corner with that exact same adjustment, if that worked well, and mirror it back to the other side where there should be a light on and there isn't.
Yeah. No, perfect. Yeah, I agree with that. So the other question I wanted to throw at you, Don, on this one was, since you're the master of Photoshop and compositing and putting a bunch of images together, where do you stand on, like, I'm looking at this image and I see symmetry, right? I see architectural strength and symmetry, and, you know, it's a calming kind of image. But I want to mess it up. Like I want to put something in there to make it asymmetrical, like a moon or something. Would you agree with that? Like put a moon in there on one side?
You know what? I don't like photoshopping a moon into photos. Maybe because I've seen it done horribly so many times.
Yeah.
And you know, it can easily look fake. But adding something to break the symmetry, even if it's a really, really small component in a photograph like this, could work well. Like, for example, we've got the steps leading up to the front of the building. What if there was somebody sitting there in a red coat?
Oh, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Because then you've got that, you know, little tiny splash of color that guides your eye right down to that little, and they might just be sitting there completely unaware of the scenario, and that becomes a visual anchor point, especially if they're off to the side, one side or the other.
Yeah.
So that, I think, would be, well, harder to Photoshop in, but maybe if you're taking the photograph and you're planning to make this image, get your significant other out there. Maybe they've got a colorful coat that they could put on and be a component in the frame.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, you know, maybe throw King Kong hanging off the side of the structure or something.
Whatever works.
Oh, yeah, I love it. Cool. All right. Thanks, Mark Domke, for your submission of the Nebraska State Capitol building from the air. All right. Next one is up from member Brian Fisher. He's got two in here, actually. The first one, both of them are untitled. Looks like they're roughly the same topic, same subject. Let's bring that up here. What do you think of this one? This is image number 4.
The bee, like devouring whatever it wants to inside this flower, is a really interesting story. And I love when you've got that narrative on a macro scale, which is a harder thing to accomplish than it is on a personal scale. So, you know, kudos to Brian for getting that in there. There's a little bit of motion blur on the antenna, and I like it. Actually, it gives a sense of motion and activeness in the frame, with the core subject still being nice and crisp. The eye is mostly in focus, which is great as well. You know, you always have to have the focus on the eye. I might have liked a little bit more of the body of the bee, because I could tell that the wing is also sharp, and there could be a nice leading line in that bottom left area of the frame that would guide my eye through the photograph. One other thing of potential interest is you can see the bee is chowing down, but you don't actually see that. It's like, you know, biting into a hamburger, but there's a menu up in front of somebody's face, and you don't actually get to see them eating. I hate pictures of people eating, but as far as that analogy goes, the little mandibles or mouth parts, whatever you call them on a bee, it'd be really great if the photo had, you know, like maybe a split second before or after. I always shoot this stuff myself in rapid bursts, because you never know what's going to happen from one frame to the next. If that bee's face, you know, the front part of it, just a little bit obscured by those pistils in the middle of the flower, were visible, I think that it would be a stronger attraction to the action that's happening here.
Yeah, yeah. And not much to add to this. I mean, you are the king of macro, right? So you're a far better judge of this one than I am. I agree. Yeah, I want to see more of that bee's head and maybe a little bit more of his body. You know, I'm assuming it's a he.
Though I like the fact that it is such a simplistic image. I mean, we don't
Yeah.
need necessarily more than this.
Three
You've got
elements,
a lot of
right?
leading lines from the flower that guide your eye right back into the center. If the bee's wing was one of those leading lines, I think it would be a nice visual starting point to the frame.
Yeah. Could you see this one blown up big?
Well, it depends on how much he's cropped in on it, and I can't quite tell from the file that's submitted. But there is enough detail to make this into a larger print.
Yeah.
As soon as you do that, though, you'll notice softness in certain areas that you don't notice on a regular level. So the main what do you call the middle part on a bee? Is that's not the thorax? Is
the abdomen? I don't know.
Abdomen? Maybe
Yeah.
it's the abdomen. It's a little soft, and I don't notice it when it's viewed small, but it would probably be a bit distracting if it was printed very, very large, because I don't like out of focus foregrounds. It's not necessarily a pet peeve of mine. Some images work well with it, but because it's part of the primary subject, it might be distracting if you go really big.
Yeah, out of focus foregrounds generally. I mean, you see those when people are doing miniature type photography, right? Where you're doing the tiny, you know, you're forcing perspective kind of, and you're trying to make an aerial shot look little.
So far out of focus, it's just like a little blurry texture or color that kind of dapples the foreground, and that's fine too. I completely enjoy that.
All right, let's pull up the next one. So this one's also from Brian Fisher.
I love the fact that in both of these images, you don't need to see the entire flower. And I often have to untrain people that are into macro photography and they take a course from me, because it's not, you don't think of it as a subject. Like the flower, you need to see the whole thing. You can see a portion of it. You can see a portion of a tree and still get the effect that it is a tree. You know, you don't lose that when you cut half of it off.
Right.
And so I think that Brian has done well with both of these images in that regard. I dislike, at least in its current state, this kind of spider webby stuff in the middle of this flower. It just kind of adds clutter to the frame that doesn't add much in its current context. But what if you were to take a spray bottle and set it to its mist setting and add a bit of mist to an image like this? It would get caught in that spider web and make spherical water droplets like dew, and maybe you'd get some interesting patterns showing up on the petals as well that would really add another dimension to a photograph like this.
Really good point. Yeah, like having and the trick is to add a little bit of glycerin to water in a little cheap grocery store spray bottle and spray it on plants like this. That way it adheres a little bit better. And
well, the interesting thing about glycerin, and that you're right, in certain cases it changes the viscosity properties of the water so that the water droplets that would normally roll off would stay in place a little bit better. For a subject like this, they would probably stay static on their own. If this is part of a bouquet or a potted plant, I made the mistake once of buying this beautiful potted chrysanthemum for my wife, and I tried, the glycerin, adding it to the water, thinking, okay, well, business expense first, because I can take some interesting pictures with water droplets on it in a spray bottle. When you have that spray that has glycerin mixed into it, when it dries, it looks an awful lot like snail slime.
Oh.
So then when I gift that to my wife afterwards, it's not a good idea.
Yeah. So if you're gonna do this kind of technique with glycerin, do it with used flowers that are destined for the trash can, right?
Or something that's in the garden and the rain will wash it away.
Yeah, I love it. So in the case of this image, you highlighted or you drew attention to the little spider webs in there. Would you, as a macro photographer, get in there beforehand and tweeze those out of there, or would you just get in Photoshop and remove them? What's the best?
Well, I mean, I've done that in Photoshop before, and it's a lot like knitting. It's muscle memory with the clone tools. It just takes time. It's not that difficult, but it's much easier in camera to just take a little. Like I've got in my camera bag a paintbrush that can clean that sort of stuff up. A small little artist's paintbrush, and I could do that. But also, if you didn't want them, if you didn't want to accentuate that as a feature in the frame with the water, this is a flower that probably doesn't bloom on its own. There's probably one next to it somewhere, right? So maybe you just choose a different flower that doesn't have any spider webs on it, and ergo, the problem solves itself.
There you go.
Something worth commenting as a final stage here is the background I like. It's a dark green, complements the flower very, very nicely. In macro photography, changing the background, if it's non-appreciative of the foreground, is a really easy thing to do. And a lot of people don't realize how easy it is to change. Put a piece of paper there, a photograph that you have that will be out of focus anyhow. It doesn't matter. It's just changing the colors and the context of the background. In this case, you could even pick this flower, put it into a bunch of other flowers that just give background color that might be different if you wanted it. There's a lot of creativity where you can make the shot instead of just taking it in situ.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Great, 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 great. All right. The next shot is from Howard. So this one he's titled Wolf. And guess what? It's a wolf. What do you think of this one?
Accurate title. It works well in black and white. I think that the lines and the shapes, especially the connection to the eyes in the wolf, really draw me into it. But then my eyes connect to its gaze, and its gaze slam into the edge of the frame. You know, it's looking off towards the left, and there's no space for it to be looking into. This is an image that would survive very, very well if you just added space on the left-hand side that is completely void of detail, just negative space for that wolf to be looking into, gazing off into the distance. And I think that that would really enhance the image. Because the background is completely isolated, even if you didn't have that data there in camera, you could easily do that in post just by extending the canvas in Photoshop and using content-aware fill. Right. And I think that you would survive that quite nicely. Yeah. The only other point of contention in this image is how close the one ear is to the edge of the frame. To me, it's riding that edge just a little bit too close. Either crop it off a little bit more intentionally or give it a little bit more space, but connecting so close there, it draws my eye to it more attention than should be deserved to that particular part of the frame.
Yeah. Yeah, good. When I see this shot, the closeness of the ear doesn't bother me. In fact, I think I think that was a decision that Howard may have made to crop in that tightly. Because when I look at this shot, I immediately, and maybe it's just the way my brain works, but I immediately start seeing geometric shapes. I keep seeing triangles.
And I love them. Yeah.
Yeah, the triangles of the ears, the triangle. I mean, even the way he cropped it accentuates the triangles. Even the head is a triangle. And the gaze, his eye is kind of the eye socket in the eye is kind of a triangle too.
I like it.
Yeah, I like that. And the square cropping, I feel like that's 100% intentional, and filling the frame with the wolf like that to kind of bring you in uncomfortably close to this animal, right? Who could maul you. Right? So,
well, if that's the case, then he should be looking like head turned, but eyes in my direction. Right?
Yeah, menacing.
To really draw in that danger factor. And to carry on the point about the ear, I'm not talking a huge shift. I'm talking like 10 pixels left or right here.
Okay.
And so if you were to bring it down, you look at the left ear or camera left, and it's got whatever that gap is of white pixels on the top. If you cut that in half, that ear still works fine, and the left ear would work fine as well. Or if you add in 50% of that gap, then it would equal. It's not a huge shift, just enough to bring it off of the edge.
Love it. Great shot, though. This is great.
Yeah, I love it.
And when I look at the shot, I'm wondering, like, it's hard to get cues other than, I guess, maybe the eyes. It's hard to get cues on if that wolf looked like this, or did he convert this to black and white? Or was it all? Did the wolf have a little bit of color in it, like a little bit of brown in the fur, and he just knocked it out? You would have always
had a little bit of color, and so it is a black and white conversion to be sure. But I don't think that hurts the image at all. I think it quite enhances it because it's not about the color. If it had any, it would be so muted that your eye might go to like the whites of the wolf's eye, and not the actual point of its gaze. Or if he had some dirt on his fur somewhere, it would be a distraction more than any help.
Yeah. Troy Miller and I talk about that a lot when we do these critiques about color, and does color actually add to the photo or does it take away? And if it's not really adding to the story or the narrative that you're trying to tell, try a black and white version and see if that makes it makes the subject stand out more.
Photography is a subtractive art, and one of the things you can subtract from a photograph is color. If you're trying to simplify it and the color is serving no purpose, get rid of it.
Yeah, I love it. We say that all the time. Thank you for echoing that. Love it. All right, let's move on to the next image. We're cooking with gas here. This is good. Okay, so the next image is from TWiP member Andrea, also known as Andy S. And I have to issue an official apology to Andrea because she submitted several images for previous TWiP Pro critique sessions, which we've talked about. And I kept, because in the system her name was this Andes, I kept calling her he. So Andy S, and she rightly corrected me, and then I did it again. So, so Andrea has submitted this next image. She calls it Cactus Splendor. Let's bring that one up.
Oh, it is a splendiferous photograph. I mean, I love the fact that the background is the cactus. I mean, there's nothing beyond that. It's like the cactus could stretch on for, you know, a meter in either direction. And this is a wall that has a feature, and that feature is these beautiful blooms. So I think the framing is really quite nice here.
Yeah.
It might be slightly overprocessed to bring out some of the grungy textures and features, which works well in certain parts of the image. The brightest, greenest parts that are the stalks of the flowers specifically, I love the effect there, and on the flowers themselves. But when it hits certain parts of the blemishes in the background, it grunges that up, I think, a little bit too much for my liking. So if you could apply that selectively to the photograph in post, I think it would greatly improve the attraction to those really cool green textures that are more vibrant and more saturated. This is an image that I would add a layer of polish on. That again, I mentioned it earlier with the spider web on the flower. Here in camera, I could, like, in situ, when I'm in a scenario, I could easily clean up some of the little bits of fluff. There looks like there's a fiber of some kind in the upper left-hand corner, little bits of hairs and stuff. I would go in and spend the 10, 15 seconds to clean those up, because that'll be 10 to 15 minutes of post-processing to clone that stuff out. And in doing so, I think it would help the image stay true to the core focus with no distractions whatsoever.
I love that, because what you're saying is, like, with making changes to the image before you actually click the shutter, it's saving yourself time later, but it's also forcing you to be more critical of the image instead of just walking around and snapshotting things like a tourist. You're actually, you know, you're sitting there, you're thinking about the composition, you're putting things in place, you're removing things that are distracting, and then you take the image. So yeah, I love that.
Exactly. Yeah. And oftentimes you'll have to walk around the subject to a different angle, and that might give you a different idea as well. I like this angle, but who's to say that there isn't other opportunities that when you spend a little bit more time finessing the subject, that those ideas might come to fruition. Yeah. The fact that there are 4 flowers doesn't really bother me too much. I would prefer an odd number there, because there's all of the other stalks that are about to bloom. I kind of wish that there was a little bit more space on the top, although I don't know if that's possible, because there might be another one of these little branches, if you can call them that, on the cactus, right above that. So the crop might have been necessary to be the way that it is. But I enjoy when you make the image the entire world. Like, there is nothing else but this cactus, and it works nice.
It's a whole little ecosystem. So the only changes that I notice in here that I would give feedback on is the 2 flowers, the 2 bloomed flowers at the top. The edges of them compared to the 2 below it seem blown out. So there's no detail in there. So I'm thinking there was, depending on how you lit it, and if you were shooting in RAW, you may be able to recover the detail in there to bring them more in line with the 2 below it. That, and then the other thing was that there's a stalk or a flower that's about to bloom that's sticking and reaching off the frame on the left side of the frame. I would either, I mean, I wouldn't want to rip it off the plant itself, but in Photoshop, maybe you try to remove that to stop it from reaching out, because it feels like I'm looking at it and it looks like this, like you said, Don, it feels like almost like a little tiny planet, self-contained world there, and then that one stalk that's reaching out of the frame, almost cut off by the frame, distracts me. And I feel like it was more contained to the middle, it'd be much more tiny planet, weird alien landscape-ish, you know?
And what you would be able to do is a 2-step process to kind of fix that. Number 1 would be use the liquefy tool to just kind of smush it back in towards the other stuff. Yeah. But that would disrupt the background and the vertical lines in the cactus. Right. But you've got enough of those lines towards the bottom of the frame that you can clone over the disrupted area and kind of heal it and kind of fix that as well. So pulling it all the way back in.
Do a little surgery. Yeah, fun stuff. Cool. All right. So we got another image, and thanks, Andrea, for that one. She submitted a second one here. She's calling this one When Night Falls. Let's bring that up here.
You know, I love the concept of this image because it's gloomy. You don't have anything that passes beyond like a middle gray kind of level here. The image has been processed to fade off the trees because we really don't need to see all of the detail in their texture. It's just the background ambience to the photograph. To me, the flare in the upper right-hand corner kind of tells me this is a day shot converted to sort of a night shot in post, because any light source that is giving this dull kind of light wouldn't create a flare that is quite as vibrant and drastic. At least that's what my mind is kind of going to. I would try to take the one little spot of a foreground that is at the very, very bottom, or background rather, the lighter, not quite a triangle, but some sort of rhombus shape, and darken that down to match the overall lighting profile above it, just to kind of keep some consistency there. I'm also seeing what might be a sign that this is a composite, right where you've got, I'm not sure if this is a boat or a hammock or what the structure is in the foreground. It's hard to tell, but where the brighter peak comes down and it meets the other structure, there's a really it's small, but there's a brief moment where the tree area is overlaid on top of the foreground subject. And so that tells me that the background is put in place on this frame. And there's a couple of other locations where you can spot that as well. I mean, it's a good composite, but if you're going to go this far, go that extra mile and just clean up those edges so nobody can tell. Yeah.
This is cool. I love the grain texture in that, in the whatever that object, the wood or whatever that is on the right side. I love that. I'm a little bit, when I look at the trees in the background, it looks spooky. Like, first of all, this image looks spooky. Like, it's like,
yeah, well, it has a good mode to it, like a good feeling, and that atmosphere is a hard thing to generate in a photograph.
Yeah.
So we were able to create that through a composite, but I'm not going to knock you any points for that because that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, no, yeah. When I first looked at it, you know how you look at all the images en masse and you're like, oh, okay, this one looks. And when my eye went to this one, I was like, oh, that one's completely underexposed, it's too dark, or whatever. And then when I get to it and I actually look at it on its own merits, and you know, when I look at her title, When Night Falls, this is. You know, she hit it, you know, right on the head. There's something, I don't know, in the background. I'm not sure what she did there on the processing, like Vaseline on the lens or something in post. I'm curious as to what she did back there, because it's not bothering me. I'm just like, my brain is trying to figure out what's going on back there. Like, was that shot through plastic or what is going on? So,
if you've ever taken the clarity slider to the maximum negative value, you get something that looks very much like this.
Oh, so, really?
It could be a simple post-processing trick like that. And you can always double up that effect in order to push it even farther if you want to. So I think it's done in post, but it doesn't hurt the image at all. It keeps the focus where it needs to be.
Very cool. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for submitting both of those images. Very cool. All right, we've got a couple more. We're on 9 of 14, so we're moving pretty quickly here. The next one is from Howard, and he's titled this one "Boots and Truck." Here you go. What do you think?
I love the narrative that this kind of plays out, because really, I mean, maybe this is a part of fireman culture. But you've got these boots and overalls that are just kind of sitting there on the front corner of the truck. But it's not just one person that did that. There's one in the background too. So I don't know, is this a ritual or part of the procedure where, you know, when you get out of the truck, you just leave your stuff there, or maybe it's waiting for you to throw on and jump in. To me, that's an unknown. And I kind of like that, because it's like, okay, this is a subculture I have no knowledge of, but here's a glimpse into that. Now, I know a lot of fire trucks are, you know, very brightly colored in red. And so to convert this image to black and white removes the color from the truck and puts the focus back on those boots. So I think that the black and white conversion here is apt. I think that it was a well planned decision. I'm looking around the frame and trying to think, okay, well, is there any way to simplify this? Again, the subtractive art idea. There's another truck to the right. I like the fact that plays into context. You know, that you've got two of them, maybe more of them, ready to go. But do I necessarily need to have the top of the frame? If I were to crop down a little bit more so that there's a distracting white light at the top of the frame on the left-hand side in the background, if I crop down to just remove that, I could create a bit of a triangle with the bottom edge of the windshield of the truck. And so if I could make that windshield intersect with the top edge of the frame, there's a nice triangle and a nice leading line that would guide my eye around the frame a little bit. But it wouldn't remove anything that defines the image as a fire truck itself.
Yeah, yeah. So this one, let's see, let's get that off the screen. So this one is interesting in that it, you know, when you look at images like this, I think photojournalism, obviously, right? So this is obviously a photojournalistic image. And I also think that, okay, this would be interesting in a set of images where he's telling the story of this particular fire station, right? So, you know, like you were saying, maybe these firemen just returned from a call, or they're on standby waiting for a call or something. And this is the state of either we just got back or we're getting ready to leave. So I love that, but I'd love to see in context, or having these in context in other, let me get this off the screen. Having these in context in other, with other images surrounding it, so that you get the feeling of, this is a story. This is a photojournalism story with supporting characters and supporting actors in the shot for you. Right.
And I always think that the best image tells the story all at once within the same photograph. And if you could try to tell the narrative simply but accurately, with a long-lasting appeal in a single photo, then more power to you. But that's not always possible. So if you could play that out over a series of 3 to 6 images, I think that would be a wonderful series. And then that becomes something that is ripe for having text associated with it for a journalistic purpose as well, which carries that story forward even further. I often shoot multiple versions of an image from different scenes, or a behind the scene photograph, just to kind of tell the narrative of what I'm showing people, you know, how they can take the image themselves, or what the different possibilities are. And that becomes fodder for magazine articles that I write. So always think of a series when you've got something that, yes, we can see a part of their life, not enough to tell the whole story here. So you either bake it into the same photograph or spell it out over a short series. Don't make 10 images. Please make it less than that, because it has to be succinct.
Yep. Yeah. Unless you're doing some sort of groundbreaking story for National Geographic, and they said, you know what, we need 30 images of this, you know, insert issue on the planet, you know, because we need to tell this over 30 images. All right, well, cool. So the next one, thanks Howard for that, Boots and Truck. The next one is from Kyle Nishioka. Kyle's titled this one Valley of Fire. Let's bring that up. There you go.
It is well, it's a beautiful valley. I love the diagonal spiked ridges through this. It feels like it's weathered over time. It's lasted forever, and this is the state that it will be in for the next 1,000 years.
Totally. This could totally be Mars, couldn't it?
Yeah, there's very little life here. There's a couple of small shrubs, and they're somewhat immaterial. I'm glad that they're in the foreground to give a little bit of life to the frame, but it does feel desolate. And I like that about the image. It works well to that effect. You've got the foreground, or the middle ground peak that breaks the horizon line, and the background that kind of comes in beyond that. So you've got a good foreground, middle ground, background, as you would in a landscape kind of composition. But it's hard to connect them directly together. Right? There's no solid diagonal line that goes from the lit foreground that then drops into shade. But if I follow that lit foreground off to the very right edge, it doesn't really wrap back around to that peak the way that I want my eyes to jump from one point to the next. The lens flare from the sun is kind of helping me with that a little bit. I think it's a valuable component to the image, because it breaks across the horizon and almost makes its way to that foreground element. And the little bits of color in there, that's the only sort of rainbow vibrancy. It's coming from the sun. And I don't mind that at all. It's not a distraction to me. It's just adding a little bit of depth without adding that color or vibrance to the landscape itself, which doesn't need it. I think it works better without it here. This would be an image where I would put like a 10 stop or 15 stop ND filter on, and take those clouds and create some really nice blurs, because this would make it feel timeless. It is standing here for eons. The clouds go by, nothing else moves, and it would just kind of echo that same sentiment of, okay, this photograph, if I came back here 10 years from now, I could make the same image because nothing is going to change.
Yeah, or an eon from now, right? It's
Yeah.
going to be the same. Yeah, my thoughts on this image are there. So just first from a technical standpoint, that sun is bright. So yeah, I'd want to, like you said, throw an ND filter on there to knock that back a little bit so you can, you know, have it less of a flaming hotspot on the left side. It doesn't bother me that much. But what I would probably clone out of here are those two light refractions below there on the left side. So those are, I mean, that's an easy clone tool fix to knock those out of there because they're distracting.
To me, I like those.
You like the flare?
Because it draws my eye to that as a point of saturation within the frame. And I know that it's not in the subject itself. It's created by the sun and the lens and all of that. But
so you're a J.J. Abrams fan, I can tell, right?
Well, I suppose. Now, what I might clone out is the secondary ones. There's the brighter ones, and then there's an almost rainbow, like a solid band of a rainbow that is kind of hiding behind them. I'd take those ones out because that seems weird to have like a solid band that is a perfect rainbow in a rectangle right behind those other flares beyond it. But I think it could be a valuable piece of the image. A flare is not always something to get rid of. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there are flares within Photoshop that you can add, right? So.
Yeah, some people want them as an effect. In fact, the new Adobe update to Lightroom and Camera Raw with their camera profiles, some third-party companies have jumped on and have programmed flares into camera profiles that you can do that right off the get-go.
Wow, look at that! We've come so far. Now we're figuring out new and exciting ways to add imperfections to our images, just like, you know, Instagram's been doing forever. But the other thing that I change in here, I agree with you on the sky. I want that sky to be more saturated. I want it to pop out a little bit more. And I like the layering because you got in the far distance, there's those dark brown hills. And then a little bit further, there's the red sort of iron laden rocks there. And then in the foreground, there are these brown rocks. I want to pump up the saturation a little bit more so I can see more of a delineation between those different strata, if you will, going back into the distance, and then pump the sky a little bit more. I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's subjective on the clouds. I agree with you. Yeah, it would look awesome, timeless with moving clouds in there, but I don't mind them static either. But I'd want to see more of that more saturated blue because there's a lot of cool colors in here that kind of say, hey, this is, you know, this is nature. Look at what we did. You know, we got white clouds, we got blue sky, we got reds, we got browns, you know, and look at that little sun thing over there, you know, so make it all stand out a little bit more. But I love this stuff. Like Kyle Nishioka's crushing it with the work that he's submitting. Kyle's an interesting TWiP Pro member because his work is across a variety of genres. Then it's exciting to look at it because I can see that he's the quintessential lover of photography that is just experimenting and trying new things and then submitting them for feedback. So bravo, Kyle.
Yeah, one final thing about this image, it's bugging me now that I've been staring at it for a while. Just crop the left edge in about 10 pixels. If you scan the very left edge of the frame, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a little bright spot about halfway up the frame. Some light is hitting a rock or something.
Oh, I see it. Yeah, I see it.
Just clone it out, crop it in a tiny little bit. Just put the polish on an image like this. It deserves it.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. Well, Kyle Nishioka, thank you for submitting that. All right, the next image is from a new member, Gordon Burnett. He calls this one Light Painted Skull. Light Painted Skull. You ready for this?
Well, that's exactly what it looks like. And so I'm curious as to how he light painted this. It looks almost like sparks that would come off of a sparkler or something that are interacting with the skull. And I know some people play with fiber optics that are lit with like a flashlight, and you can dangle that around and get similar effects where they're never repeatable, but they can create these interesting lines and shapes that guide your eye through a particular subject. It seems a little bit out of focus for me. Maybe it's the resolution of the frame, but for a shot like this, I would put the camera in manual focus, focus, of course, on the skull, and then leave the focus there, turn the lights off, and work your magic. But it's an interesting experiment, and I've done some experiments like this before. The fact that there's some kind of coming out of the, where an ear would otherwise be. I would like some to be potentially lighting up inside the nose cavity, the eye sockets, a little bit more than just on the one edge of the frame, because it's somewhat inclusive of the skull, but it seems like it's almost riding past it. Now, that said, this kind of abstract imagery is generally pretty hard to critique. So I might be a loss for words beyond that, but I'm curious what you think, Frederick.
Yeah. The first thing I noticed, and you hit it on the head initially, and that was it doesn't seem to be in focus. And I think that might be an artifact of doing an extremely long exposure and then light painting it. Something moved, like the camera moved or the table moved or wherever something moved in there. It made this a little bit soft. It doesn't feel like it's out of focus soft. It almost feels like motion blur softness in there. But aside from that, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you're right. This is completely abstract, so it's not like you could say, well, next time you need to have this. This is an artist just in the pure sense of the word, just saying, hey, I wanted to tell this story. And again, in photojournalistic terms, this could be part of a larger story, right? So this could be a story about, I don't know, some band or something that he's using this technique to illustrate it. And it's a good example to photographers of using the tools, right? Because we have lots of tools in our tool belts to tell stories. Light painting is just one of them. In fact, I remember, I think it was last week or the week before, the previous artist, Kyle Nishioka, submitted a light painting shot, and now Gordon's doing it. So yeah, this is cool. My only criticism, I don't have any criticism otherwise. I like the shot. I like the concept. The only thing is your eye goes to it and it's looking for the sharp part and it doesn't find it. And that's distracting.
Yeah, well, and I might say I like the fact that there are multiple colors here. The purple magenta color is a great addition to otherwise having it solid blue, which I think would feel too flat.
Yeah.
But then this is ripe for experimentation. Experiment.
Totally.
Throw in a different color. What if you had some of it light painted with this beautiful blue color, and then you switched colors to add some orange into that mix, maybe on the other side of the skull?
Sure.
Whatever you want to do. I'm not sure if that would be better or worse, but it would certainly be different and give you some creative ideas to push forward with.
Yeah, I love this. These guys are inspiring me to get out there, and thanks, Gordon, for submitting that, by the way. They're inspiring me to go out there and try some light painting, because I've been experimenting. I love the whole time travel aspect of photography. The whole idea of speeding up time, slowing down time, compressing time, taking things that were shot at different times and putting them in the same time. And light painting is just one of those. It's just it's almost like real time. Slow time. I don't know. It's interesting. I love this stuff.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Next shot up is from a new member, Janik. And I believe this one's Untitled. Here we go.
I love the fact that this image is it's complex. There's a lot of stuff happening
so
here,
cool.
but it all seems to coalesce so beautifully. Again, color not needed for this image. It would add complexity that would distract me from these beautiful vertical lines. It almost feels like it's an infrared shot, but I can't quite tell because the foliage is really quite bright. It could just be the way that it's processed, but it works really well that way. When it comes down to critiquing an image like this, again, it's mostly abstract. Where's the narrative? Well, maybe it doesn't need one. Maybe you want to try to add one. Maybe what if there was Little Red Riding Hood in the frame?
Oh, yeah. I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
And, you add a personal narrative, somebody walking into these trees and looking back towards the camera. Maybe that could be useful.
I see a guy walking away from the camera with an axe.
Yeah. Oh, that would be perfect. The axe with blood on it too.
with a hockey mask on or something, right?
But when I look at the edges of the frame, there's only one thing that I would consider, and he probably did this in camera. And if he didn't, well, then next time for sure, is if you were to take a step left or right, the vertical lines would stay vertical and the overall framing would stay the same. But if you notice the gaps in the trees on the left edge, you've got 3 trees basically overlapping and there's 0 gap in between. But there's a lot of gaps on the right side in between those trees. So if you could just nudge the camera a little bit to add an equal number of gaps in between those trees on the edges of the frame, it would frame the image a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm gonna disagree, which is great because this is why we critique. We have differing opinions. I love this image. So Janik, thank you for submitting this one. I love it for several reasons, because when you first look at it, my brain wants to say, oh, the left side is repeated on the right side, but then like you pointed out, Don, the gaps give it away. So no, it wasn't. This was actually most likely like this when he shot it. This is not a reflection, but it's you blur your eyes. If I blur my eyes and look at this, I can see 4 main areas. I see the triangular foliage in the foreground. I see a rectangle in the middle, in the far back, and then I see 2 parallelograms or whatever, on the left and the right, sort of. And it's all organic. When I look at this, I think symmetry but anarchy.
Yeah, and I'm surprised at how well the vertical lines with diagonal lines leading, like they kind of lead you to a not exactly a vanishing point with that rectangle in the center. It all coalesces to be something that's really cool, really beautiful.
Yeah.
There's one thing that the longer I stare at it bothers me slightly, and it's a quick cloning fix. In that central rectangle that you mentioned,
at the top,
one of the trees does not reach the top of the frame.
Yeah.
So there's one in the middle that just kind of arbitrarily stops.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's just a shorter tree. It's like something happened and it just got cut in half. The obsessive compulsive person in me wants that tree to reach the top of the frame, although I know it's natural and maybe I should just accept that.
But it adds tension, right? You're like, there's one thing. But the portrait or the people photographer in me wants a person in there, but let me preface that with, this could absolutely be printed big and hung above a couch in any home in the world, right? It would look great.
Oh yeah.
With a nice black frame on it or something, or even no frame. It doesn't
have to be a person, Frederick. What if there was an owl sitting on one of those branches?
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, at that point though, don't be photoshopping stuff in. Maybe that this scene is frequented by birds, or maybe depending on the kind of context that you're into, maybe you could stick a peanut on a branch and have a bird come in and enjoy that. But if this image had an actor, whether it's human or otherwise, it would just immediately spell fairy tale scene.
Totally. This makes me think Renee Robin when I look at it. Like I could see like a scantily clad woman in there walking or frolicking, or I could see a minotaur in there, or an elf peeking around from one of the trees, which is great, because this is what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to spark your imagination, and I think that Janik has hit it out of the park with this. He did a great job.
I agree.
Very cool. See all the submissions that we get in TWiP Pro. People are crushing it in there. It's making me feel bad. I'm starting to get the same kind of feelings of inadequacy that I got when 500px showed up. You're like, I can't submit anything in there. Look at all this good work. No, you guys, they're doing a really good job. All right, we're in the home stretch here. We've got 2 more. The next one is from member Mark Harris, and he has titled this one Monique. There you go.
And this, it is the human landscape, and I'm generally not a fan of
humans,
human nudes, humans in general. But I don't photograph naked people myself. It's just not where my interests lie. But this is done really well. It feels like a layered landscape. Like you have different sand dunes running across the frame, the different edges of somebody's back with their shoulder blades. And the curve, I think, works really, really nicely. The fact that this is so minimalistic makes it elegant to me. And I can't think of anything technically that I would necessarily improve upon this image. In this kind of a photograph, though, there is no frame of reference for up, right? There's no horizon line that you need to keep straight. So would it make sense to rotate it so that the shoulders are higher than the backside, or does it work better this way? I'm not sure, but this has blackness all around, so it'd be very easy to just rotate it maybe 15 degrees and try it on different angles to see exactly how those lines connect across the frame a little bit better. I have one question for Mark, however. Looking at the EXIF data for this photograph, it's f10 ISO, 1/200th of a second exposure time, which is probably a flash sync speed. Why is it taken at ISO 6400?
Well, maybe he lit it with a flashlight. You never know, right?
Maybe it was intentional, maybe not. This image could easily be made at ISO 200 for all it matters.
Yeah.
And then you could add grain into the image if that's what you were after the fact. But for an image at ISO 6400, unless I was looking at the EXIF data, I couldn't necessarily tell. So kudos to the D850 that he was using for handling high ISO well. But from an artistic perspective, whatever the camera settings were, I think he's got a good shot here.
Yep. Very cool. Yeah. And I look at this. I do like these abstract nude shots like this because I look at them and I think, you know, landscape. Craig Colvin is known for this kind of.
This is right in that wheelhouse, right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I look at these and I always my brain is weird. So my brain goes to, you know, I like it like this, but then my brain goes to, yeah, I could see people hiking in there, you know, or, you know, you see the sand dune scenes, like if they kind of, you know, you do a composite where it kind of looks like a sand dune, but it's actually a human, but you see tracks when someone walking up there, you know, it's just kind of, I like that kind of like photo that makes you think.
That would be really cool. I would like to see this image kind of modified in that way. Now,
wouldn't it be cool? Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, but I mean, it's cool. I like when I just look at this image on its own merits. I like that it makes me look at it longer to try to figure out, because we all know what the human form looks like, right? I mean, beyond any other form, we're familiar with what our own form looks like. But when I look at this, my brain is instantly like, okay, what position was this person in, and where's the butt? Oh, the butt's on the right side. Oh, so what was the arm stretched out? Is this a male or a female? You know, my brain is going in all these directions, and I think that's good because it's pushing me to think more about the image versus just, oh, look, here, there's a person that's laying on their back. You're laying on their stomach.
And the fact that the negative space is placed above the image makes it feel like it's sky in a landscape as well.
Yes, exactly.
Nice balance there.
Here's another, you can put a moon in there. See, there you go. Every shot needs a moon in it. Every shot. You got to put a moon everywhere. All right, Mark Harris, thank you for that. That's called Monique. All right, the last image is from Craig Stampley. He calls this one Montague Road under the William Jolly Bridge. Let's bring that up. Montague Road under the William Jolly Bridge.
I love the lines of the car moving through the frame. I think that just connects things together really, really nicely. Yeah. It's a longer exposure at a very small aperture, and you can tell that by looking at the starburst effect of the streetlights above, which I kind of have a love and hate relationship of. In this case, I like it. In some cases, it just does not suit the image well, but I think it adds a little bit more drama to the top part of the frame that would otherwise be a little bit less interesting. Keeping in mind that you've got the taillights going through one pathway here, yeah. I'm seeing a little bit of ghosting of what might have been a vehicle running on the right side of the frame, and you've got some lower lights that are white and kind of connecting across there, but they don't feel as dramatic as the red lights that are cutting on the other side of the frame.
Yeah,
it feels almost like it's the lines of the road rather than the headlights of a vehicle. So what could you do? I love the two-way traffic, but if there was a taller vehicle and it looks like he's standing in the middle of a road, I hope he's not. If he was on a safe place, then waiting for like a bus or something to go by that would hit against the right edge of the frame, that would take those lines and draw them taller in the frame, making them a little bit more pronounced. I did a similar shot through an aqueduct that had like a highway running through it in Istanbul, and we waited for a tourist bus to go by, which kind of took those lines and dragged them higher into the frame. That really helped the connection of the photograph altogether. The exposure is good. I don't mind the framing whatsoever, especially because you've got the red lines that kind of connect on a nice diagonal on the left side of the frame. What say you, Frederick?
I agree. I like this image. I like the colors, maybe because my favorite color is red. So I like the colors. The colors pop out of there. The long exposures, I always like we were just talking about a second ago. I like the compression and the stretching of time. So those shots I always find interesting. Because, you know, that's what we do as photographers. We record light and find new and interesting ways to record light. And this is a new and interesting way to do it. I like the starbursts from the long exposure on the two street lights at the top. What I'd want to see as a people photographer is like we were talking about in that other image, what is the story element in this, and that could be as easy as, over on that, standing on the overpass there, maybe there's lovers up there kissing or something, or somebody standing on
somebody like smoking a cigarette looking at the traffic going by.
Yeah, or getting ready to jump or something, there's something up there to like add interest in that upper right lower third area, because that's where my eye goes. I'm looking at it and I see all this action, then I go right up there, and
you could put a moon there, Frederick.
You could put a supermoon in there and fill up that entire blue with a supermoon.
Oh, don't do that.
No, don't do that. No, don't put a moon in there. But yeah, but to have like a silhouetted couple up there would be interesting, or just two people talking or something, up there, just to add a kind of a story element and a quote reason why, end quote, about why this photo is taken.
Yeah, and I can see some people walking on the street now that I look at it long enough. They're just blurs on the sidewalk on the left edge of the frame underneath the sign there. And so what if somebody was like sitting up against one of those pillars looking at their phone? Maybe that would be an interesting, or maybe reading a book, it doesn't matter. But just to have a static human element in the frame that's not blurred. Like you said, the people up top, but the people on the bottom as well. That element could be anywhere in the frame. Now, if you can't get somebody to cooperate to be there for you, one theory that I've executed a number of times is jump into the shot yourself. It can work. Where if you set your camera on a 10-second timer, but then have it locked on a wired remote. So a wired remote will have the ability to lock the shutter button down on continuous shooting, which, depending on how your camera operates, for a longer exposure like this, you don't put it on the delay. You just lock that in. The first shot, you're not there. The second shot, you might not be there, but the third one, you are. And just stay there as a static component to that particular frame. And, looking at your phone, doing something interesting. So long as you are in arm's reach of your camera, or you have somebody else with you so nobody runs away with your gear. But you can be that component that you want, because wouldn't it be great if somebody was up on that bridge looking down over the traffic? Well, what if that's you or somebody that's with you? I mean, you can orchestrate this. You can control those elements to some degree. And I think that this image is a good scenario where that extra step could at least be considered.
Love it. Cool. Great. Craig Stampley, thank you for submitting this. And, thanks to all the folks that submitted images for this week's critique session. These are getting really good and becoming a valuable part of the TWiP PRO community. And Don Komarechka, thank you for coming on and lending your expertise and your eyeballs to these images.
It has been a joy, Frederick. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. All right, we'll end this one now. We're just over an hour in. I know folks have things to do, but again, TWiP PRO members, if you want to get your image into next week's critique, make sure you submit them by Sunday evening. We typically try to record these on Monday, at some point Monday mornings, ideally, if all things go according to plan. If not, it could be Monday afternoon. But try to get your images in by Sunday, and we'll get them off to our guest critics, and so that they can have time to digest them and form opinions. Other than that, that's it for this session of the TWiP PRO critique. Don Komarechka, any parting thoughts?
These images were great. I mean, I wish everybody, the best of luck with what they create next. And I hope that this feedback drives them to a new creative idea, or to take a photographic risk, an idea that might not pan out, but hey, you know what, I'm going to do it and just see what the result is, even if it's not going to make a great photograph, because that becomes a stepping stone to what will probably be your next best work. And then the next best work after that. And just keep riding that along. Every time I critique images like this, I get ideas myself. And right now my head is just spinning with new concepts and ideas to explore. So thank you to everybody for doing that.
Yep, I agree. Same here. All right. And with that, it's time to end this session. You know what I always say at the end of pretty much everything. Take that lens cap off. Peace, everybody. We'll see you in the next one. This is TWiP.